The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, hollow quiet that tells you something is wrong. Machines hummed beside my bed, lights blinked above me, and my body felt like it didn't fully belong to me anymore. My mouth was dry, my head throbbed, and my hands shook when I tried to move them. A nurse noticed and rushed over, telling me I'd been unconscious longer than expected.
Complications, she said.
But I was alive. That was supposed to be the good news. Days blurred together after that. Pain medication stole time from me, and sleep came in broken pieces. When I was awake, I stared at the ceiling and thought about home. I pictured the familiar creak of the stairs, the sunlight hitting the living room floor in the late afternoon, the front door that never quite closed properly unless you pushed it twice. That house was my safe place. Thinking about it helped me breathe when my chest felt tight. I wasn't strong enough to worry about much else. I let my sister handle things. She said she was taking care of my bills, my mail, and anything the hospital needed. Every time she said, "Don't stress, I've got it," I felt grateful. Family was supposed to protect you when you couldn't protect yourself. One afternoon, she brought papers and a pen. She told me they were required to keep my insurance active and to authorize communication while I was sedated. My vision was still blurry, and my hands barely worked, but I trusted her voice more than my own thoughts. I signed where she pointed. Once.
Twice.
3 times. Each signature felt heavier than the last, though I didn't know why. I didn't find out the truth until a nurse casually mentioned it. She was adjusting my fore when she asked, "So, where will you go after discharge?"
"Home," I said.
She hesitated.
"Oh."
"I thought you knew." That hesitation lodged in my chest like a warning. Later that night, my phone buzzed with missed calls and messages. When I finally managed to open one, my hands went cold. A neighbor said there were strangers coming in and out of my house. Another message mentioned a real estate agent. Then a photo appeared, my front yard, my porch, my door. There was a sold sign planted in the grass. My heart raced so fast the monitor beside my bed started beeping louder. I stared at the screen, waiting for the image to change into something else. A joke. A mistake. Anything but reality. When my sister came back the next morning, I showed her the photo. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look sorry either. "You weren't in any condition to make decisions," she said calmly. I did what had to be done. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I couldn't sit up. I couldn't leave. I couldn't even raise my voice. All I could do was stare at her while the truth settled in. While I was fighting to stay alive, my sister had sold my house.
And she had done it legally.
From that hospital bed, I realized something worse than the surgery had happened. I hadn't just lost a place to live. I had lost my safety, my trust, and the one person I believed would never betray me.
I didn't sleep after that.
Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sold sign again, bright and mocking against the grass I had once trimmed myself. My heart kept racing, setting off the monitor until a nurse came in to calm me down. She thought it was anxiety from the surgery. I knew it was something else. It was the feeling of being robbed while still breathing. In the morning, I asked for my chart. My voice was weak, but my mind was clear for the first time since I'd woken up. I read every page slowly, my hands trembling as I flipped through the documents. Then I saw it, a copy of a power of attorney form. My signature was there at the bottom, shaky but unmistakably mine. The date matched the day I barely remembered, the day the painkillers made the room spin, and my sister kept telling me to just sign. My stomach dropped. She hadn't broken into my house or forged my name. She had waited until I was helpless and convinced me to give her permission to destroy me. When I confronted her again, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She sat in the chair beside my bed, crossed her legs, and spoke like this was a business meeting. "You had medical bills," she said. "You were going to be out of work for months. The house was an asset just sitting there." "That wasn't yours," I whispered. She sighed, irritated. "You're being emotional. You should be grateful I stepped up." Grateful. The word burned. I asked where the money was. She told me part of it went toward my hospital expenses.
Part of it.
The rest, she said, was complicated. Investments.
Debts.
Temporary transfers. Every answer was vague, carefully worded, and designed to confuse me. When I demanded proof, her tone changed. You need to focus on recovery, she said sharply. Stress could set you back. That was when I understood something terrifying. She wasn't worried about my health. She was worried about control. The next day, I asked to speak to a hospital social worker. It took hours, but eventually a woman came in with a clipboard and a cautious expression. I told her everything about the papers, the sale, the way it all happened while I was medicated. She listened carefully, but didn't promise anything. If you signed while mentally impaired, she said, you may have options, but it won't be easy. Nothing about this was easy. By the time I was discharged, the house was already gone. The locks had been changed. My furniture, my clothes, my personal files, everything had been boxed up and moved into a storage unit I'd never seen. I wasn't allowed to go there alone. My sister insisted on helping, hovering over every step like a guard. I moved into her guest room instead. It was supposed to be temporary. She reminded me of that constantly. Every meal came with a comment about money. Every favor came with a reminder of what she'd done for me. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her footsteps in the hall. I felt like a guest in someone else's life, stripped of independence, reduced to a burden. But beneath the fear, something else was growing. Anger. She thought selling my house had ended the story. She thought the papers meant she'd won. Lying there in the dark, I made a silent promise to myself. If she took my home while I was unconscious, then I would take back my life while fully awake. Recovery was slower than the doctors predicted, but my awareness came back faster than my strength. Each day, as my body healed, my mind replayed everything that had happened. The signatures, the timing, the way my sister spoke to me now, calculated, impatient, like I was an inconvenience she'd agreed to tolerate. Living under her roof made it impossible to ignore the truth. This wasn't help. It was captivity dressed up as concern. She controlled everything. My medications were locked in a cabinet only she had the key to. My mail was opened by mistake. My phone disappeared more than once, only to reappear on the kitchen counter with a casual excuse. Whenever I mentioned getting a lawyer, she laughed. With what money? She asked. You should be realistic. That was when I started paying attention. I noticed how nervous she became whenever the phone rang. How quickly she stepped outside to take calls. I noticed the stack of unopened envelopes she shoved into a drawer when she thought I wasn't looking, bank statements, legal notices, things she didn't want me to see. For the first time, I realized she wasn't as untouchable as she wanted me to believe. One afternoon, while she was out, I forced myself to stand longer than I was supposed to. The pain was sharp, but it fueled me. I opened the drawer she always locked and found the papers she'd been hiding. The sale contract was there. The power of attorney copy. And something else, a notice from a lender with her name on it. Past due. Final warning. The pieces started to fit together. She hadn't sold my house to save me. She'd sold it to save herself. Her debts were larger than I'd ever known. Credit cards, personal loans, even money borrowed from people whose names I didn't recognize. The sale money hadn't gone into a separate account for my care. It had been scattered, plugging holes in her own sinking life. When she came home, I was sitting at the table with the papers spread out in front of me. She stopped short, her face draining of color. You went through my things, she said, angry but scared. You went through my life, I replied. For the first time, she dropped the calm mask. She accused me of being ungrateful, of ruining everything, of forcing her hand. She said I owed her for taking me in, for managing my crisis. Her words spilled out fast, desperate and ugly. That argument changed something between us. After that day, she watched me constantly. I felt it in the way she hovered, the way she questioned every message I sent, every step I took toward independence. But she'd made a mistake. She'd shown me fear. As my strength returned, I started making quiet moves. I contacted the hospital records department and requested documentation of my medication levels on the days I signed the forms. I reached out to a legal aid clinic using a library computer when she thought I was at physical therapy. I learned words she hoped I'd never hear: undue influence, incapacity, financial exploitation. Each step felt like stealing something back. She sensed it. One night, she warned me not to cause trouble and reminded me how fragile my situation was. But the threat no longer worked. I had already lost my home. Fear had nothing left to take from me. What she didn't know was that the walls she'd built around me were cracking. And soon, everything she'd taken would be exposed. The lawyer from legal aid called me back 3 days later. I had stepped outside under the excuse of getting fresh air, my heart pounding as I answered. He spoke carefully, asking precise questions about the timeline, my medical condition, and the circumstances under which I signed the documents. When I told him about the medication, the ICU stay, and my sister presenting the papers without independent witnesses, his tone shifted. "There may be grounds to challenge the sale," he said, "but you need evidence. And you need to move quickly." For the first time since the hospital, hope felt real. I started documenting everything.
Dates.
Conversations. Text messages. I wrote them down in a notebook I hid inside my old backpack, the one my sister never bothered to check. Every time she reminded me that I owed her, I recorded it. Every time she restricted my access to money or threatened to withdraw support, I wrote it down. What she thought was control was turning into proof. Meanwhile, her behavior grew sharper. She complained loudly about the cost of my food, my therapy, even the electricity I used. She reminded me that the guest room wasn't permanent. She suggested I look into shelters or cheaper options once I was fully discharged from care. It was clear she no longer needed me, and she was tired of pretending she did. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to me from a law firm. She opened it before I could stop her. When she saw the letterhead, her face hardened. "You're suing me now," she snapped. "I'm protecting myself," I said. That night, she exploded. She accused me of betrayal, of trying to ruin her life after everything she'd sacrificed. She said no judge would believe me. I'd signed the papers, and that was the end of it. When she realized her anger wasn't stopping me, she changed tactics. The next morning, she was suddenly kind again. She made breakfast. She talked about finding me a small apartment. She even suggested giving me a little money to help me start over. It was the same pattern I'd seen my whole life: damage, then distraction. I didn't accept anything. Instead, I focused on regaining full independence. I pushed myself harder in physical therapy. I reopened my old email accounts and discovered messages from realtors, banks, and even the buyers. Emails I'd never seen because she'd redirected everything to herself. One message mentioned a rushed closing and unusual circumstances. Another confirmed that the buyer had been told I was permanently incapacitated. That line made my blood run cold. She hadn't just sold my house. She had lied about my future. The lawyer confirmed what I suspected. If we could prove she misrepresented my condition and benefited personally from the sale, the power of attorney wouldn't protect her. It would condemn her. The night before I was supposed to move out, she stood in the doorway and told me I was making a mistake. She said family should handle things privately. She warned me that once I crossed this line, there was no going back. She was right about one thing: there was no going back. Because the next step wasn't about forgiveness or family anymore. It was about justice. The formal complaint was filed 2 weeks later. I wasn't present when it happened, but I felt the impact immediately. The air inside the house changed. Conversation stopped. Doors closed harder. My sister barely looked at me, except with a sharpness that made it clear she finally understood this was no longer something she could control. I moved out the same day the paperwork went through. Not into anything permanent, just a small furnished studio arranged through a local assistance program. It wasn't much: one window, thin walls, borrowed furniture, but the door locked from the inside, and that mattered more than space. For the first time since the hospital, I slept without listening for footsteps. A week later, she was served. She called me nonstop that night. I didn't answer. Texts followed: angry, pleading, threatening, apologetic, then angry again. She said I was destroying the family. She said I was ungrateful. She said I'd regret this. I saved every message and forwarded them to my lawyer. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The hospital released records confirming I'd been heavily medicated at the time I signed the documents. A nurse provided a statement saying my sister insisted on being present and discouraged staff from explaining the paperwork to me in detail. The real estate office handed over emails showing my sister had claimed I would never regain full capacity and needed the sale completed urgently. That lie became the turning point. The buyers were interviewed. They admitted the speed of the sale felt strange, but they were reassured everything was legal. When they learned the truth, their cooperation changed. They hadn't wanted a stolen house. They'd wanted a deal. My sister tried to settle privately. She offered me a portion of the money, far less than the house was worth, in exchange for dropping everything. She framed it as mercy, as if she were still in charge. I declined. Court hearings began quietly, without drama or shouting. Just facts, documents, timelines. Sitting there, I watched her shrink. The confidence she once wore so easily disappeared under questioning. When asked where the remaining sale funds had gone, her answers fell apart. When asked why no independent legal counsel was present during the signing, she had nothing. The judge ordered a temporary freeze on the remaining funds and opened a civil case for financial exploitation. Criminal charges were still being reviewed. After one hearing, she cornered me in the hallway. Her voice was low, desperate. She asked how I could do this to her. She said she was scared. She said she never meant for it to go this far. I looked at her and felt something unexpected. Nothing.
Not I. No satisfaction.
Just clarity. She had made her choices while I was unconscious. I was simply responding while awake. By the end of the month, the sale was officially challenged. The house wasn't immediately returned, but the process to unwind the transaction had begun. It would take time. Months, maybe longer. But for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, the future wasn't something that had been taken from me. It was something I was rebuilding. And no matter how long it took, I knew one thing for certain. She would never have control over my life again. The waiting was the hardest part. Court dates were spaced weeks apart, and every delay felt like being suspended between two lives, the one I lost and the one I was trying to build. I returned to work part-time, still tired, still healing, but determined to prove I was capable. Every paycheck, no matter how small, reminded me I was no longer completely dependent on anyone. The legal pressure on my sister intensified. Subpoenas followed. Her financial records were pulled apart line by line. The debt she'd hidden came into full view, along with cash withdrawals made days after the house sale closed. The pattern was impossible to ignore. This hadn't been a single bad decision. It was a calculated act. She stopped contacting me altogether. Her lawyer did all the talking now. I heard through relatives that she was struggling, unable to sleep, borrowing money again, blaming me for everything. The same family members who once told me to be understanding began to ask quieter questions. They started to realize the story they'd been given didn't match the facts. During mediation, the buyers agreed to rescind the purchase in exchange for reimbursement of their costs. The judge approved the arrangement. The house would return to my name once the remaining funds were recovered and liens cleared. It wasn't over, but it was a major victory. The criminal review concluded shortly after. Charges weren't dramatic, but they were real: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, misuse of power of attorney, and misrepresentation. She avoided jail through a plea agreement, but the consequences followed her everywhere: fines, probation, mandatory restitution, and a permanent record that would never fully disappear. When the ruling was read, she didn't look at me. I expected to feel something powerful in that moment: relief, triumph, closure. Instead, I felt steady, grounded, like someone who had finally stepped out of a long shadow. A few weeks later, I stood in front of my house again. The sold sign was gone. The maple tree was still there, taller than before. The front door still stuck unless you pushed it twice. I unlocked it with my own key and stepped inside, surrounded by dust and echoes, but also by memory. It didn't feel the same, and that was okay. I cleaned slowly, room by room, reclaiming the space on my own terms. Some things were missing, others damaged, but none of it mattered as much as I once thought. What mattered was that the house was mine again, because I fought for it. I never spoke to my sister after that. I didn't need an apology or an explanation. The court record said everything she never could. As I sat on the living room floor that first night back, I understood the final truth of it all. She took my house while I was helpless. But she lost everything trying to keep it. Time did what the courts and arguments never could. It settled things. Months passed after I moved back into the house. Life didn't snap into place the way movies promise it will. Repairs took longer than expected. Work was slow. Some nights were still heavy with memories of the hospital and the betrayal that followed. But the silence inside my home was different now. It wasn't empty. It was mine. News about my sister reached me occasionally, through others. Probation meetings, restitution payments, jobs she applied for and didn't get. People who kept their distance once they understood what she had done. I didn't ask for updates, but I didn't avoid them either. They were reminders, not of her failure, but of my survival. The family divided, the way families often do when the truth is uncomfortable. Some said I should have handled it privately. Others finally admitted they would have done the same in my place. I learned quickly whose support was conditional and whose was real. That knowledge stayed with me. I sold the house a year later. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. The maple tree was taller. The walls were repainted. The front door still stuck, and I smiled when it did. Letting it go felt nothing like losing it. This time, the decision was mine, and that made all the difference. I used the money to start fresh, somewhere new, without ghosts or locked drawers or signatures I couldn't remember making. On the anniversary of my discharge from the hospital, I sat alone in my new place and reflected on everything that had happened. I thought about how easily trust can be weaponized, how quickly help can become control, and how dangerous it is to assume blood equals safety. I also thought about strength. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind that signs paperwork carefully, that asks questions, that keeps copies, that doesn't back down even when it's tired. I never heard from my sister again.
No apology. No explanation.
And I no longer needed one. Closure didn't come from her words. It came from the life I rebuilt without her. What happened to me didn't define my future. It sharpened it. I learned that survival doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like standing up slowly, one step at a time, and refusing to lie back down. My sister sold my house while I was in the hospital. But she didn't take my voice. And she didn't take my life. I took both of those back myself.